If you've ever wondered how to come and swap an old classic Ford truck, then stay tuned for this episode of Dentside Depot, because I'm going to go over the whole process with you, everything I did, the mistakes I made, and what I might have done different from top to bottom, everything you need to know from getting the engine in there to the intercooler and everything else. So let's check this out and how I did this particular truck. Okay, so what we have here is a 1979 Ford F350 Super Cab that has been come and swapped, a 12 valve with an NV5600 6-speed transmission, a Dodge transfer case, a Dana 80 rear, and a Ford Kingpin Dana 60 front axle. The cross member on the late model Dentsides is going to interfere with installing the Cummins engine. So there's two things you can do. Number one, you can cut down the frame, make it smaller, and then weld in a top piece, or you can put in a different cross member. And this applies only to the 4-wheel drive trucks. The 2-wheel drive trucks do not have this particular problem, and they're much easier to swap. For my particular truck, I used Auto World conversion brackets specific for 77.5 to 79 Ford trucks. And essentially how I did it was I bolted in the new cross member first, and then I actually cut out the rest of the frame that was there and just made a metal plate, and I capped it on each side. Now, the reason I chose to do this was because it allowed me to do all of the factory Dodge AC components, which saves a significant amount of cost compared to having to buy aftermarket ones. Then by doing so, the engine simply just drops into place because they provide the mounts that you need in order to make this conversion successful. You can see we have plenty of room, firewall clearance, and everything else. And if I ever had to pull the engine out of this truck, I'm pretty sure I could just pop the hood off and pull it right out with a gantry crane, or using a lift to pull it out, and it wouldn't really be an issue. Okay, now let's take a look at the transmission, and this is where things start to get a little bit more complicated. So this is obviously an NV5600. The way I made this conversion work was Auto World Conversions also sent me a transmission cross member, and I just simply drilled out the holes after I had my pinion angles set, put in an automatic transmission mount, and essentially it did just bolt right in, but there's very, very little clearance from top to bottom, but it did fit. Now, I do have dual fast coolers on this particular truck, but I had to machine this one down to 50% of its typical capacity because of drive shaft clearance. And then on this side, it barely fits. There's enough room that I feel comfortable with it. Transfer case is obviously the factory Dodge transfer case. This is the 241 DHD, so it's the heavy duty one that has the better tail shaft on it that's a little bit stronger. This isn't the strongest transfer case that you can get. But it's definitely a good transfer case overall, and parts are easy to get for it. Now, the reason I did not go with a larger transfer case was because I was having issues with it hitting the frame. It was not going to fit. So my really only options were one of the older, smaller transfer cases because the bigger one, like I said, would not fit. And the reason for that is the Auto World Conversions bracket centers the Cummins engine more than would be with a Ford engine, would be from the factory. So it's only offset to the passenger side by about 1/4 inch. Both of my drive shafts, front and rear, are from Tom Woods, and I would highly recommend using them. They are an outstanding drive shaft company. And that brings us to the rear axle. Okay, the rear axle is a Dodge Dana 80 axle, and the reason I chose this axle is because this is what you would find factory in the Cummins trucks that had the manual transmission. Now, this particular rear is the factory disc rear. You can only get this rear in 2001 and 2002, and I really wanted the factory rear disc brakes, and that's why I went through the trouble of sourcing one of these axles and rebuilding it and making custom brackets and everything else for it. And I think it really worked out well. One of the things I really like about this axle is middle wheel spacing is significantly wider, and it matches the front axle and really offsets the truck really, really well. Now let's get into more of the functional aspects of this truck concerning the chassis and how I engineered everything. One of the things I did was I did add a rear airbag system on this truck in case I do some heavy duty towing once I have it set up for that. So that took a little bit of time. But I'm happy with how that came out, and it rides really nice with that installed. The rear springs are a Skyjacker 4-inch lift for a Super Duty truck, not a Dentside Ford truck, but a Super Duty. And the way this works is Battleborn Brakes has a bracket kit that they sell that you can convert your Dentside to a Super Duty suspension, which is really trick. And these springs are much longer and bigger than a Dentside Skyjacker 4-inch lift spring would be, and I really wanted to add that heavy-duty aspect to this truck and really bring it up to modern standards. I used a Tremor 3¼ inch lift block, so this truck does have a significant amount of lift in the back, but I really wanted that. I like the back sitting up a little bit higher than the front. I know some guys like the front up higher, but that's just my personal preference. The fuel system, you're really going to want to look at doing a sump style. You can also use what they call a draw straw, but your sump style system's going to be the best because you do not want to ever starve a diesel system from any type of fuel, because you'll get air in it, and obviously that's not good. So the way I did it was I used one of the plastic Dentside Ford tanks, and I retained the sending unit for the gauges, obviously, but I drilled it out just like you would a regular Dodge tank and installed fastest system there, and that came out really well. I had no issues with that. I used their 5/8 feed line, so it has a significant amount of feed. And you can see we have the fast lift pump installed on one of the chassis brackets, and that came out really nice, and it does not stick down too far, which is what I was really looking for. And while we're under here, you can see I installed battle-borne brakes, upper suspension brackets, and then I used Sky Manufacturing for the lower brackets for the suspension system, as well as the track bars. Now let's look at the exhaust system, and believe it or not, the entire exhaust system is a factory OBS Power Stroke 4-inch Diamond Eye system, and all I had to do to make this fit my particular truck was just add one little piece that made up the difference between regular cab and super cab, and it really bolted in really nice. One thing I did do was I made a custom suspension hanger system here, so it goes right up to one of the cross members and comes down, and it really is really in there nice and strong. It's not going anywhere. There's multiple mounts everywhere, both clamped on and welded on, and I feel really good about how that came out. Okay, a major consideration you're gonna have to figure out before you get started with your swap is, does your Ford truck have factory air conditioning, or is it a heat only truck? Because that's going to make a significant difference with what you can and cannot fit under the hood of this truck. Now, the Dentsides are known for having plenty of under hood room, and you can really take advantage of that with this particular swap. Me, I have an HVAC truck, and that significantly reduces the amount of room there is for the manifold and the turbo. If you have a heat only truck, you can put the manifold either way, and you will not have a clearance issue. But for me, my manifold needed to be flipped, and my turbo had to be mounted up instead of down. By mounting the turbo up, I was able to achieve just enough clearance from the HVAC box for the intercooler pipe. I could probably adjust and get a little bit more clearance. And then you can see my downpipe also is fairly close, but again, it has plenty of clearance, and I made sure to heat shield everything. I'm going to put a little bit more heat shielding on the HVAC lines before I get it charged up, but overall that fit out really nice. And I believe I used a first gen Dodge flanged downpipe, added 5 inches to it to make the difference for flipping the manifold over. For the intake system, I decided to do something significantly different from what most people do. Most people just have it come out and it just sits right here, kind of like the factory Dodge truck was. But I really wanted my intake system to not only look nice, but to also be functional. I made a significant change with the battery box and how I did the intake. I did a 5-inch intake tube, and obviously it goes down to 4 inches at the turbo, but I wanted to make sure I had plenty of air, and clearly that's plenty of air right there. And then I built in a box system into the fender well. It actually bolts in, kind of hard to see down there, but it bolts in. It's aluminum. It has a 5-inch K&N filter on it, the biggest one that you can really get. And then I also did put a pre-charger on it, so no water could possibly get into the engine. And one other thing I did, which is kind of hard to see, but in my fender well, there is a 4-inch delivery tube that coming from the front of the grill support, and it's pretty much impossible to see, but there's a cold air intake behind the headlight that can suck in cold air and not get any water to make sure that I'm getting plenty of fresh air into the intake system. That brings us over to the battery situation. And for these Cummins trucks, you really want to have a dual battery setup. But obviously the way I did my truck, I would no longer have room for a battery on the driver and passenger side. Well, the way I did this was I came up with my own design where inside the fender well, there is an additional support bracket that goes from the inner fender, which is not really designed to hold much weight at all, down to the radiator, the core support, and you can see those brackets down here. And that makes it so this is so strong you can stand on top of this and it's not an issue at all. Now I only have one battery installed right now. That's because I'm still doing draw testing. I don't want to kill two batteries because it's still a fresh build here. But once I know that I don't have any parasitic draw, I'll put that second battery in and I should be good. And I can run two batteries, both on the driver's side, which is not something you would typically see. Now you could mount these on the chassis as well, but I really like the battery up in the driver's compartment where they're out of all the dirt, debris, and everything else. Intercooler is going to be one of the most difficult decisions that you need to make to swap your truck. Obviously, if you are not doing a turbo, then you do not need an intercooler. And if you're just going to do a non-intercooled truck, then obviously this doesn't pertain to you either. But by doing the intercooler, you're going to be adding a significant amount more work to your build. Now, my truck features a early Power Stroke Ford intercooler. I believe it was early 2000s is the one that I used. And essentially what I did was I cut off the factory brackets on the top and we welded on new brackets, and they essentially just bolted right into the firewall right there. And I used furniture hockey pucks to make sure that it had good insulation. Side behind the grill area, there's an additional support system on each side that goes into the firewall, and that connects directly to the intercooler. And again, I just ordered off of Amazon furniture chair ends and just pushed them on their rubber ends, and it holds the intercooler in really nice, and it has nice insulation to keep it from bouncing and breaking or whatever else. And you can see this is still a mock-up grill. I'm going to put a nicer grill on it eventually, but you can see I did not have to do very much trimming with this setup. Most of the grill fit in, very little trimming. I did a kind of a bad job right there, but again, this grill is going to get replaced eventually. But you can see it actually fits going all the way across. Where you're going to have another significant fabrication piece that you need to work on is the hood support. Now, the factory hood support is not going to fit. It's not going to fit at all. You're going to need to make a custom setup. The way I did this is I took the factory setup and I banged out the edges where it's kind of concaved a little bit. Instead of having bolts that go in, I inverted the bolt, welded it from the other side, cut it down so I would have plenty of room for my intercooler to fit in. And you can see now, instead of having a bolt, it has a nut on each side to hold the hood latch in, and that worked out really nicely. Another thing I had to do, which we'll talk about when we talk about the radiator here, is I actually cut the hood spring support out, trimmed off about a 1/4 inch, and moved it so it's flush with the core support. While we're here, let's talk about the air conditioning really quick. Now, this truck does have a completely factory Dodge air conditioning setup forward of the cab, except for the condenser. The condenser right here is a universal one, and I actually was able to use the factory Ford brackets. I modified them slightly, but it fit in very nicely between the intercooler and the radiator. And then I made my own lines going to my dryer and then out to my compressor and to the core. And that worked out really nice. And the nice thing now is if I have a parts failure, I can just order a factory Dodge AC compressor and I'm good to go. Now let's talk about the cooling system. And this is another part that definitely requires a little bit of time and work and effort on your part. The way I did this was I wanted to have what's commonly known as the desert cooler, the bigger radiator. I went with an aluminum one from Champion, and this would actually be for the 2-wheel drive trucks. It has a different core support angle that can better meet the angle that I was going to have with my Cummins engine. Now, when I did this, I cut down significant pieces of the radiator to make it fit. I do not have a shroud on it yet, but it took a lot of test fitting, pulling out, putting back in, and getting it to fit correctly. So that was definitely a lot of work. It's the factory 94 to 98 thermostat housing, and then I just used silicone hoses from Amazon, and I 90'd it up all the way to my core, to my radiator, so it would fit nicely and I could just retain factory parts, which was really the goal of my build. Bottom hoses, that's going to be where more of a challenge comes in. Essentially what you're going to do is you're going to go to AutoZone and you're going to buy like 30 hoses, and you're just going to sit there and work it out on a piece of paper until you get it right. And that's essentially what I did. I have 5 hoses that go together with various connectors to get all the bends and everything else that I needed to make it fit and make it clearanced. Let's take a look at it from the bottom. It fits pretty nicely, and I used billet aluminum connectors to connect it together. And I have nice clearance between my hose and my damper, so that worked out really nicely. And you can see compressor also has good clearance. There's my overflow hose, and you can see how nicely the compressor fits in. And I can pull that compressor out without removing the engine. Everything is fully serviceable, just like it would be in a factory Dodge truck, which is really what I was looking to do with this particular build, and I'm happy with how all of that came out. And you can also see that I have enough fan clearance that I can pull the fan out without having to pull the radiator or anything else, and that fan is perfectly lined up with the angle of my radiator going up, which is exactly what I wanted to see. Let's talk about the power steering really quick. This was a lot of work on my part trying to figure this out. Eventually did was I used an industrial style pump, and I eliminated the vacuum pump and the regular power steering pump from my truck. So I have a VAR from Wild Horses that flows down to the industrial style pump and then to a hydro booster, because this particular truck has all of the newer style Dodge 2500, 3500 dual piston front calipers on it, because clearly it has an extensive more weight than it would a factory truck. Now let's quickly talk about the electrical system. A lot of people say that these trucks do not have good harnesses on them. I totally disagree. I think the factory harness on these particular trucks is very durable. Obviously, if someone has hacked them up at some point, then they're no good, but a good factory harness, there's nothing wrong with that. So the way I did this particular build was I integrated the required electronics of a 12-valve Cummins engine, which is not very much. It's essentially just power and ground plus the sensors, and I integrated that into the Ford harness. I actually used 2 relays for this truck for the starting system. So I retained the factory starting relay, and essentially that relay is powering the relay on the Dodge starter. Now, of course, that does create 2 points of failure. So if one relay goes bad, then the truck doesn't start. But I like the factory Ford relay because you can run accessories off of it like the fog lights, which is why I wanted to retain that. And you can also see I have my fast system comes up here as well, so I can get power directly to 12-volt source. And that all worked out really well. Okay, the clutch system is definitely an area of concern. What I did for my build was I built this metal box right here out of a really good gauge steel. I have a mock-up firewall, so I mocked everything up on that firewall first so the clutch could go in and have a really, really strong point of connection and not flex on the firewall. There's no way that's going anywhere. And the way I hooked the hydro booster up was with Battleborn Brakes kit. Okay, looking inside of the truck, you can see right here is where the clutch master cylinder or slave cylinder goes through the firewall into my box, and then I made my own system up here on the pedal. There are companies that sell their own, but I wanted this particular truck to retain the factory style Dodge cylinder, so I went through the time of making this whole system up. That took an extensive amount of time and effort and fabrication, but now if I ever have a failure, it's just simply taking the factory Dodge part out, putting the new factory Dodge part in. I'm actually using South Bend parts, but that part will just come out. It's fully serviceable, and it will not take any time at all to replace. Throttle pedal is another area of consideration. I used a universal 12-valve Cummins throttle cable kit. That did not take very long to set up, and all I did was cut the top part of the factory pedal, reposition the angle, and weld it on, and now I have perfect articulation of the pedal. And that really did not take that much time. It was just really figuring out the angle and where I was going to put it. Back to the electronics, you can see here that we have 3 types of integration. We have the 12-valve Cummins engine integrated. Then we have Dakota Digital's boxes are integrated into the system. And then I have an additional interior fuse box that is just running systems like my vacuum pump, my compressor, and a few other small things. Okay, and inside the cab, because I do not have a vacuum pump, I have this right here. It's an interior vacuum pump that runs my mode doors. This is my compressor to run my bags. My shifter actually worked out really nicely. It's just the factory Dodge NV5600 shifter, and it's the standard shift lever, and it worked out perfect. And then I went with an aftermarket shifter for the transfer case, and that came out really nice. And that's pretty much all you need to know with modifying. Now let's talk about how much time it takes. Okay, now a project like this is going to take a significant amount of time, especially if you go the route that I did with essentially every single part being custom. There's almost no factory parts left on this truck except for the front axle, the power steering box, and the pitman arm. Pretty much everything is an aftermarket part of some kind. You can expect to spend many, many months on a project like this and a whole lot of money. There's definitely easier ways to do it. This is just the way that I in particular wanted to do it because I didn't want to have to do any of it again. If you have that time and you have that money and you think you can do some fabrication work, then this is definitely a great project. I hope you enjoyed this technical episode of Dentside Depot talking about my come and swap truck. We're going to be pulling into the next project this week, so definitely stay tuned. Keep restoring those classic trucks, and we'll see you in the next episode.